All right, George, Vahe, Deb, thank you for joining us. I feel like we're so early in the generative AI revolution that today we are all being called upon to be futurists. So we're here to discuss the opportunities for foundational models in banking and financial services. So let's start by being futurists. I want all of you to give me a near term, let's call it 1 to 2 years, and a longer term, maybe 5+, potential for the use of generative models at your companies. And Deb, we can start with you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Brad. I would say near term, we are looking at a number of use cases, I think somewhat similar to what we've heard today in the room. So a lot of them are, I'd say, more in sort of the knowledge assist, knowledge search, helping our employees, our frontline agents, for example, be able to have access to a broad range of documents, information, and be able to quickly access and pull together a concise view of how to answer a particular, provide response to a client. So I'd say those are fairly near term, and I think we've also talked about code generation. I think the longer term, and I would say we're kind of in that second follower, class when we look at, where we fit as from PNC and the other firms that are represented here today. But I think the longer term will involve a little bit more of perhaps that kind of customer self-service opportunities, as we continue to evolve the technology in our digital channels. And I thought Manuela made fantastic points about the continuous testing. But that to me I think that is out there at some point, but not in the near future.
Vahe?
I think in the near term, it's really about building intimacy with your clients, right? I think that's the most powerful thing. We had that in the past, but it's obviously too expensive to have hundreds of thousands of employees. So we rationalize them away, but AI gives us the opportunity to come back to this era. And in the longer term, it's difficult to predict. I would say, what would the opportunities be if you can hire 5,000 Einsteins? Because I do think that we are very fast going into this era of artificial general intelligence, and we have to get accustomed to the thought, at least, that they are going to be more intelligent than humans are. And from that point, it's very difficult to predict anything, right? So I think near term, it's intimacy, and longer term, it's really to be seen.
George, you're a veteran of many Silicon Valley hype cycles. Before I let you answer, is this?
I've been blamed for it actually.
Are we overhyping Gen AI right now?
I would just go back to what was said in many of the earlier panels, which is just to remind people of the nascency of this phenomenon. Obviously, it's AI itself is a overnight success, 70 years in the making. But this node of generative AI is so new. We're only getting to the place where we have the kind of safe enterprise architectures where we can really take advantage of it. And consistent with, I think, the commentary here, super excited about it, super consequential for our industry. We have to exert a little bit of patience to see how it plays
Okay,
through.
so that said near-term opportunities and longer-term.
I was hoping I was going to get off the hook.
No.
So
Goldman.
I think the near-term opportunity, one way of saying it, there's obviously code generation, stuff like that, which I think in some ways is now table stakes. But one way we think about the near-term opportunity is, are we giving our people the opportunity to engage in higher resolution, more fine-grained semantic search? That's an area that's been in enterprise is really unsatisfying for years. But the ability to directly inspect various corpora of knowledge around the firm in a conversational manner, I think that's actually really going to happen in 24 and change the way our people work. Now, longer term, I think the opportunity is for the highest performing apex client focused people in our business to be able to turn to machines first as a creative thought partner. Just the way that they turn to colleagues now, that'll still be a part of it, but really being able to use this as a platform for creativity, new ideas. And I think that's both an opportunity and in a way a mandate for people. We're going to have to be able to use these machines in that manner to compete where the tide is rising for everyone else's capabilities.
Vahe, these models are only as good as the data that they're trained on. So when it comes to a bank or a financial service company creating an in-house model, what do they use? Is it Is it internal communications? Is it transaction data? And where do they have to be careful?
Well, I have to say I grew up in Peter Norwich's world, where he said more data beats better models, but better data beats more data. And I think OpenAI proved him somewhat wrong. They made a bet of a couple of $1 billion and just proved you can train on the internet, which is basically probably 70% wrong. But the result
That you
turns
can't
out to
train
be,
on the internet.
You can.
Or you get a couple of lawsuits in the.
Well, I mean, yes, but that's to be figured out,
Yeah.
right? That's exactly, that's still open, I guess. But the wisdom of the crowd, something very difficult to prove, works for some things, right? I mean, the weight of an ox really works with the wisdom of the crowd. If you have a question of the Higgs boson, probably it doesn't. But for many things, it does. So my initial answer would be train it on anything that you have, right? And but here comes a alteration to this. The question is, maybe it's not about training anymore. Maybe it's about putting more compute into the inference of it, right? So there are, of course, lots of papers and lots of ideas around this, but we also have to get away from this thought of not everything needs to be training. It can be fine-tuning, but even it can also be, test time compute and other technologies where at inference, you give it more time, more compute to do more validations and more other rounds to get to a better result, right? All that, of course, with your personal data.
Now, Deb, talk a little bit about PNC. You guys are a regional bank based in Pittsburgh.
That's right.
And you're charged with keeping the bank competitive in this nascent field where the table stakes to build a foundational model, maybe and tune it and keep it running, maybe tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. So how does an institution like PNC compete?
Yeah, I think, we talked about this a little bit. We're in sort of that third quartile for first time out in Evident, looking to maybe move up to second quartile. But from a second follower perspective, we want to balance where we're leveraging the GenAI opportunities to enhance and accelerate what we're already doing with basic traditional AI, because we still think we've got a pretty long runway there with some of the things we're doing in our call centers and in our operations units and other areas. So when we talk about the shiniest of shiny objects with the generative AI, we look at, well, what's the right balance? And we do think there's a definite place for that. But how do we leverage the momentum of everybody wanting to be involved in it now in a consistent way and say, those are great ideas, but actually 8 or 9 out of 10 of these ideas we can do with our traditional platforms. So harnessing that, collective energy and momentum that I'm sure probably everybody's companies are feeling, and, continue to make even bigger gains and strides there, and then have the targeted, Gen AI accelerators, often coupled with perhaps one of our existing platforms, is one approach we're taking, and being selective about that, and kind of watching to see what transpires, and then where we, quickly follow.
George, let's talk about some of the risks of using foundational models inside banks. I mean, you have advised and shepherded technology companies who seem to operate under the mantra of move fast and break things, and in large part it worked. But a model that hallucinates inside a bank with a customer, and you're testifying in front of Elizabeth Warren on Capitol Hill. So how do you view the challenges, particularly around things like, it's a plausible scenario, around things like hallucinations and security concerns, bringing these models into financial institutions?
Yeah, I mean, it goes again to this, for all of us to reflect on the nascency of this, the importance of being into operating in a regulated sphere, of being slow, careful, deliberate as we pursue this, even given how appealing and consequential this is for us. Hallucination. I don't want to steal your thunder because you said in an earlier discussion something I totally agree with, which. First of all, we do have to get used, this was raised in the last panel, we have to get used to, this is a fundamental upending of sort of everything we learned in classical computer science. Think about like the way we've built systems in the past is we want deterministic outputs. We build a scaffolding. Now we have these models that we expose to the world, and they give us an answer that's an emergent, unpredictable, delightful, scary, hallucinogenic, possibly. And so, I think that we, our regulators, are going to have to reckon with that. But I'll turn this to you, which is I think there's also a way of thinking that hallucination is not all bad. I'm not sure I'd say that to Elizabeth Warren in a congressional setting, but in this safe harbor here, I feel like that, it's another way of saying one person's hallucination is another person's creativity. So you talked about it in our earlier exchange, and if you want to expand on that.
Do banks want creativity?
I think they should want it. They absolutely should want it. And in Silicon Valley, the two of you, I realize, live there. It is really about something which is called horizontal expansion and velocity, right, of the tech sector. So really go into adjacent and sometimes not even adjacent other areas and expand very, very fast. And that is possible if you get creative ideas. And creativity and hallucination are actually not that far away from each other. I'm not claiming that every hallucination is a creative thought, but not everything that comes out of a human is a creative thought, right? So there needs to be a process to choose which ones you want to follow, but you certainly don't want to get rid of them entirely, because if you do that, you would just end up with a ever-repeating history. And I think there's even a movie about this, right? Where every day is the same day again. So you don't want to end up in that scenario, right? Exactly, you need some kind of changes in there, right? Yeah. And evolution has this through their genetic changes and sometimes crazy things that are happening, and I think we need that in AI equally.
Deborah, you as
I was just going to say the ability. One of the promising research trajectories is to be able to kind of have a slider bar around temperature on these models, because there's clearly many use cases in our industry where authoritative sourcing, precision, a reliance on fact is utterly critical. There are also moments where, I mentioned this, the long-term future of using a machine as a thought partner. A thought partner that regurgitates facts is only so helpful, somewhat helpful, but one that has an edge of creativity or hallucination, another way of saying a hallucination, I think it's actually an important feature and a unique, distinctive feature of these platforms over time.
Yeah, Deb, I was going to ask, are you as willing to embrace the risks of this kind of creativity?
I agree. I think there's scenarios where, especially when you think about, most of us are talking about human in the loop use cases, internally focused employee, primarily on employees, not customers. I think when we think about what that human in the loop does, in some cases the model output should be black or white, right or wrong, and we check for that. But in other cases, it may not be quite as clear. I think it's what you're getting to. Is it a different response, but is it maybe helping us build on, what our original intent was?
Is it practical to keep a human in the loop, particularly as these systems scale?
And I think it's necessary. It's necessary because not always to check the facts, but necessary for the judgment layer. I think today somebody talked about taking an umbrella. If you could predict if it's raining tomorrow, yes or no, right? So you can predict it, but the question is, with my beautiful hairstyle, I might need an umbrella even if there's only 20% probability of a rain tomorrow, right? And for somebody else who doesn't have my beautiful hair and doesn't care about getting wet, could say, like, I don't need an umbrella even if it's 80% probability. Right? So the judgment layer of it should be left to humans. And here I'm going to steal from Nietzsche. It should be with humans because we are the only ones that can suffer. So AI is not going to suffer if it's raining outside or not, but we are going to suffer. So the judgment layer should be with us. And this is where we actually really need the human in the loop. Even as a technologist, I'm saying that, but not always to double-check facts.
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions, I think I agree that persistence of human in the loop is key. One thing we worry about and think about is when you put the human in that situation, how do you incent them and enforce their ability to attend to what comes out of the machine? Because after the 10th experience of it looking just great, are you going to pay attention? And so, we're examining different techniques to focus people's attention on, really making sure that they are exerting the responsibility or shouldering the responsibility of being that human in the loop.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too parochial by asking who's going to pay for all this, but I've heard it said that like tech budgets at banks, 80% go to running the bank initiatives, keeping the lights on, and 20% of the budget goes to growing the bank or changing the bank initiative. So, who's going to pay for all this? Like that 20% is always susceptible to getting cut. how much of an investment that your organizations are going to investing in these new and still somewhat hypothetical technologies.
Yeah, I would say that one approach we're taking is, we've talked a bit today about the ROI of all this, right? And being able to have that solid business case, whether it's a, hardline expense takeout opportunity, creating capacity, cost avoidance, or better yet, revenue generator. And one approach we're taking is looking to have some of these business use cases, one, be elevated at the firm so they are consistent. It's no longer going to be somebody's pet project because they may have talked to a new vendor or something of the like. So bringing that standardization together, but building out that ROI kind of self-funded use case. So if you think you need a couple million or whatever million to do this, the ROI needs to be at least, some multiple of that. And, what you have to balance that with not wanting to damper the creativity and the ideation. We all know that too, we've talked about today, but that is one approach. If it's not part of a normal BAU tech line item budget, is to put forward a solid business case and get very senior level buy-in and, up to the, executive committee, board level if needed, so.
Yeah, George, is the argument efficiency and cost reduction, or is it revenue and growth?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's definitely a blend of both. First of all, I'd like to think our mix of change versus run's a little bit richer than that. But what we're finding very similar is as we go through our zero-based budgeting process, which is like in flight right now, we're finding groups actively reprioritizing and self-funding these initiatives, which is actually one really interesting referendum on the promise of these technologies when by grassroots making decisions to limit their formerly precious projects in favor of this. That makes me optimistic that there is something really important here.
Vahe, many of the folks in this room work at banks, financial service companies, but we're all customers. What is in it for customers?
Well, I think for customers, what's in it is better understanding, right? Because what you would expect from a trusted partner, and banks are trusted partners, we should not forget that, right? They have always been from the day one, and they hopefully still are, and I think I claim they are. So what would you expect from a trusted partner? Understanding. They need to understand your personal needs, your personal problems, your personal concerns, to be able to tailor a solution for your personal problems. Now, I understand that nobody wants to hear that, because when you say that, it means you need 1 million employees to do that. But now you don't anymore, because a vast majority of those could be just AI agents, right? So I think what's in it for the customers is just a better understanding and a just better relationship.
I think also more opportunity for self-service and higher quality, better, faster self-service. Because I think, especially the younger generation, I've got kids in the 20s, and they would crawl and curl up in a corner if they have to go into a branch to do something, right? Everything has to be on my phone, online, real time. I don't want to talk to a human at your bank, kind of interaction. So higher, better quality, faster, more consistent responses for some of the use cases. And also, I think, a lot are just looking for that, where they can self-service, and how we manage that and deliver that experience.
George, I want to give you an opportunity to answer, but please start thinking of your questions for the panel.
Well, as a predominantly institutional firm, I think we think about client benefit coming in the form of more compressed cycle times because of the efficiency and the speed that you can create with these machines. More creative solutions, as we were discussing, because you can explore a broader set of a broader space of solutions faster. And also, I think you can expect more rigor because, again, the ability of these machines to compress cycle times, add scale, simulate at broad scale a number of different scenarios. I think this promises both greater creativity and more rigor, which is obviously a great combination.
I promised the panelists a mischievous question, so I'm going to ask George one. And an obscure firm called Evident, I don't know if you're familiar with it, published some research a couple of months ago showing about engineering and AI talent at the large banks. And on the list, Goldman was the one that was having, I guess, the hardest time retaining AI talent. It was something like 60 researchers had left the firm. So talk a little bit about the talent war that you must be engaged in every single day when it comes to preserving and retaining AI talent.
Yep. I mean, first of all, I would stipulate to the fact that there's an enormous talent war in this space. Like, make no mistake. I would say that, look, in an organization, in an engineering organization of 12 to 15,000 people, depending how you count it, I'm not sure that that is super meaningful. Second, I think there's a funny, maybe if I was thinking through this as I read the piece, which is, there's a definitional question. It's a little bit like, what's AGI? Like, what's an AI engineer versus who's a data person, who's a software coder? And I thought, like, God, what's the methodology? How are they getting to this? And a little light bulb went off, which is, anyone who's switching jobs has a resume out there, something, no matter what they do, must have AI in their title.
Yeah.
There may be some definitional issues around this group of people, but bottom line, I think we're all experiencing it, which is we're trying to find talent in every nook and cranny, and others are looking to Goldman Sachs and other firms for people who have unique experiences in this space.
And Deb, you're in Pittsburgh. Great universities. Are you finding it difficult to identify talent?
I would say yes. It is obviously a talent war for everybody, and we've got some kind of specific tech areas that we want to have our tech AI resources be based if possible. So there's some of those constraints. But to your point around some of the university relationships, as we talked about, we're from Cleveland. So between Cleveland and Pittsburgh, there's some amazing university talent that we're looking at ways we can be more creative and develop partnerships or start a pipeline of talent in that direction, while in parallel recruiting people that would love to live on one of the Great Lakes, if there's any.
Vahe, you run a startup, so it's a little bit of a different game. But then again, Google's out there giving $1 million signing bonus. So how are you competing for talent?
Well, we don't have that problem, though. I got to have some advantage, right? I mean, they have all the money and everything, but I think our advantage is that we can get talent easier than Google can, because we can give them purpose. It doesn't matter who you are at Google. If you don't show up for work, it doesn't matter. And if you don't show up for work here, it actually does matter. So what you do has a huge effect. You can see what you're building. So I think that purpose attracts talent.
Okay, I want to open it up to audience questions. Of course, I have still a few of my own, but does anybody want to jump in?
Got one here.
We have one right here. Oh, okay.
All right.
Hey, George. For you and maybe the others too, so much talk of GenAI is on the consumer side. What do you see taking place on the capital market side, or for P&C perhaps, the wholesale side? Thanks.
Yep. Again, I think it's going to be consequential across the piece, whether you're a consumer or institutional firm. Ultimately, the institutional business, one way of saying is Goldman Sachs and PNC and others are in the business of knowledge synthesis and idea generation. And so any tool that aids, elevates, accelerates, that's going to be hugely powerful. So, like the ability to use these technologies to come up with better ideas for clients about how they can, operate in the capital markets, how they can consider their strategic scenarios. Like, it's going to be very valuable. And there's a lot of appetite among our bankers, our people in sales and trading to leverage these tools. So, highly consequential.
Yeah, I would say for PNC, as we know, we're on a multi-year journey. A lot of the first big scale opportunities were in the consumer retail bank, but now we are starting to see more momentum at scalable size. I would say before it was more of a point solution approach in our commercial bank treasury space. So we're starting to take actually some of the benefit value of what we've seen in the consumer retail and bringing that over to our treasury space, for example. And now we've got, I'd say, more traction with all the discussion out there around all the AI opportunities. So we're starting to make that transition and size the ROI.
Again, great panel. Mac Lickman again from Snowflake. So I think on this panel, and I think the priors, we've been focusing on like internal use cases are less risky, and probably where people will start. Misalignment issue, right? Where if PNC or Goldman, put out an AI to talk to customers, right? I mean, as much as you want to optimize it, do the right thing, you really want it to do more business for PNC and Goldman, where internally, you really want that employee to be more effective. So I'm curious if you've thought about that kind of, how do you think about incentives, where if I'm a consumer and I'm talking to an AI from Amazon, I know it wants me to buy more stuff, right? It's not just wanting me to kind of have a better day. So just curious about that alignment issue of like external consumer AIs versus internal enablement AIs.
Yeah, I would say from our perspective, in general, it's been a high value, low risk approach is what our mantra has been for use cases that we will put forward for POC pre-production. At this point, and I don't know, I haven't heard of too many today that are actively looking at the externally facing yet. We're looking to better enable our employees that serve the customers to be more effective and have quicker access to the knowledge and information they need. But at this point, we have not had that discussion internally. For us, being pretty risk averse, that we're going to stay with our internally focused use cases to prove them out. Make sure we've got all the right risk and controls and governance around it that we need, and kind of see what we learn from the others too.
Go ahead.
Maybe can I ask a question? Like, why would you assume that if you talk to a person, that the person doesn't want to sell you more?
I know. It's going to be
Yeah.
the same problem or misalignment.
Okay,
But I
yes.
think the internal use case,
Got it.
right, where it's clear that if you're giving something to an employee, you want them to be more efficient.
Mhm.
There's no
Absolutely.
misalignment there. They want to be more efficient.
More knowledgeable
Right.
and
You're right.
efficient.
And the outside, it's the same incentive misalignment, but it's really going to.
Yeah, you will have the same misalignment there too, I think, because we will find a way to align AI to what we want. That's necessary for us to survive even. And if we do that, we will have the same misalignment that we have with humans than with the AI. I think that's the best we can thrive for.
To establish parity of misalignment. Is what you're saying.
Exactly. That's what we're going
Fair
to
enough. I mean, one other derivative of this point that's interesting is, first of all, I just remind everybody, like financial services, the history of financial services is essentially, a repeated substitution of machine for human. Think about equity trading. When I joined the firm, we had hundreds of NASDAQ traders. Now we have less than a handful. It's like, so this routine of substitution, capital for labor happens, and yet our headcount continues to grow. And I think it's going to be a very similar situation, which is our people are not per se worried that they're going to be replaced by machines. They're super excited about machines reducing the amount of rote, low-value stuff they do so they can serve clients better. And I think that's what you'll see very similar to the way that this electronification or digitization of our industry has played out thus far.
George, this is somewhat off topic, but when you ran the TMT practice at Goldman, I mean, you witnessed the creation of so many technology juggernauts. And I just wonder what you make of, A, the entrepreneurial, and B, the investment opportunity in AI right now. Are we seeing the great re-scrambling of the technology landscape, or will the advantages accrue to the current set of giants?
Yeah, I think that's about it. It's just super active debate in Silicon Valley, and a fascinating one, because if you look historically in pattern match, whenever there's a big platform transition, which I think we can all agree this is one, it usually unleashes massive opportunity for VCs to invest in young companies. Often it's like, okay, new platform, need new horizontal tooling on top of that, and vertical apps, and I can go fund a panoply of those. I think there's a real question in Silicon Valley today, and it's a fair one, which is this a platform transition where the first order beneficiaries are overwhelmingly established big companies, or they're sort of affiliates? And really, is there a bunch of money to be made building applications on top of this, or do all those application spaces get subsumed by the growing intelligence of foundation models?
And what's your view?
I think it's way too early to say. I would say I strongly believe there's lots of horizontal investing opportunity. Think about the security and challenges we're facing, the need for more robust tooling. A lot of it may be open source, but there are commercial models around open source. I think that's going to be abundant and exciting. I think the question is it's actually a really interesting question on the vertical application side. In the near term, big incumbents in that space who cover a lot of territory, who have big mind share inside organizations, like sprinkling a little AI on top of the SaaS services they provide you, I think that's super valuable. Again, leads you to the question, like, where does the value accrue? Big companies, small companies, and again, people in Silicon Valley are pulling their hair out. So, sorry, no, don't make a back reference.
Well, I actually
You may have already done so, but
I wanted to know what Vahe's view is and the view at Cognaize. Like, I mean, obviously you're a startup. How old's the company?
4 years.
Okay, and you're navigating a world with many giants.
That's true, and we are VC funded, so I'm also dealing with VCs. I have to say, I think the big difference here is that there are markets where, and pardon my you will feel my German heritage now. I think it's a market where the second mouse gets the cheese. So it's not so much about being the first with something, because you cannot protect it, right? So if you're the first who comes up with a drug, you can protect it. You have 10 years to capitalize on this. But now OpenAI came out with a great product, ChatGPT. We all love it. How are they going to capitalize on this, right? So Stanford University and Alpaca paper showed that with $700, so actually was I think less than $700, can replicate it. So the question is, how do you protect this? How do you protect your billions of investment in this, right? And this is, I think, the fundamental problem here. I do think there's lots of room to do things. We are certainly very active in the space of privacy, of making AI adequate for institutions, because we do think that privacy really matters, and it means that you also need to be able to run AI internally, which means you need to transform something that has been proven to be superior or very good technology adequate for your personal problem, and that needs orchestration, of course, and many, many other things which we are active.
Okay, let's go back. Yeah, I think we've got one here.
I got one. Hi, I'm Marie Cabrera from EY. And actually, I think since I thought of my question, you guys have been talking about this, but it's the whole idea of the investment value of AI. And so you talked about, well, I personally think you can't afford not to invest, right, as a bank, to experiment on this.
for sure.
And then clearly, banks have always made their business decisions based on the ROI, right? But also today we heard that no one is AI in production. Right, and the use cases are primarily internal use cases, so those are going to be operational efficiencies, right, and speed. When do you think, and this is like the impossible question, who's the first mouse, right? When do you actually go into production in the marketplace, and then the strong ROI, becomes realized? And so I know that's a hard question to answer, but that's sort of what's on my mind right now, thinking about the conversation around investment value.
And I guess one thing I would say, you said nobody has AI, nobody has the generative AI in production, right? So
Yes, or
I think that's
LLM.
the big difference, or the large language models. I think, all of us have AI in the traditional platforms and continue to scale that. I mean, I think we've heard from others today. I think there are some use cases that are 3 to 6 months. But from what we see, again, the internally focused that will bring, speed and efficiency to, to our employees, often serving the customers, or to our developers writing code. There's, I think, some pretty big primary use cases that are going to be, I think they're pretty far along. No, nope, we will not be first. we are that second mouse.
And how attractive at your company?
This stage is unusual. We've had mice, cat, cows, fish. Like, what's going on? Yeah. It's like Noah's Ark up here.
Creativity through ChatGPT.
Exactly.
How attractive are open source tools at your various companies? Obviously, there might be a cost advantage, but you don't have control, and power in those systems does tend to accrue to the larger companies over time. So,
I think we're historically and I think persistently big adopters of open source technology. Now, again, as I said, there are great commercial models that revolve around open source projects, and we partner deeply with many of those people. But we have, I think, long admired and relied on open source software in some pretty key places in the firm. So, a big believer in it. Obviously, also deep partnerships with many purely commercial platforms. But I think open source is going to be critical. Now, there's this super interesting debate to be had in this space of closed model, open model, who's going to win, large, small, et cetera, which will be interesting to see play out.
yeah, Vahe, what's your view?
I think without the open source community, we would never have these advances that we have
Yeah,
now. So,
totally.
and I think it's a mix, right? You need both. I don't think it's the controllability that's a problem with open source. It's much more the support of it, right? So you really need to maintain a group of people to continue to support this. I think both is necessary, and as a large institution, you have to have a mix of both in your organization.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think the only comment is for specific large language model open source, we've tried to put some additional guardrails that it's not quite as easy to get to all of those as, may have been at one point. So just to understand, again, we're trying to be very deliberate on the focus of our experimentation and use cases. So definitely you need to have both, but we try to put some guardrails around kind of the who and when and how.
All right, I think we still have time for a few more. Any more questions for the panel? Yes, back there.
Yeah, I had one. Aaron Riccadella at Oracle. I'm interested in the panelist's perspective on getting value from this topic of customer data has come up a few times during the course of the day. As these generative use cases come online, how do you, I'm working under the assumption that banks aren't going to be building or probably even calibrating at enormous cost their own LLMs on a monthly basis. So a tech vendor is going to do that, and it'll probably run in a cloud. What are the techniques, or how are you thinking about isolating the customer data while still making sure the LLM delivers you the value from it?
That's an area you.
Yeah, so I actually tend to somewhat disagree with you. I do think that banks will need their own LLMs, maybe not a large language model in the size of a ChatGPT with 1.7 trillion parameters, but I would call it a precise LM, something that is created for that industry using their data. And that could actually be very cheap. And if you think about it, a 70 billion Llama version 2, which is commercially licensed, if you fine-tune it correctly and also do a good human preference fine-tuning on top of it, easily outperforms a ChatGPT with 1.7 trillion parameters and can be run, if you quantize it well, on an A10, which is basically a glorified gaming computer. So it's absolutely doable to do it, and I think it would be dangerous to send all your data to just an OpenAI. And don't get me wrong, I really love OpenAI, but it's hard, I think, to see a future that turns out to be good if you send all your data to OpenAI.
I mean, there's an interesting topic underneath that, and then a theme that I think about a lot was just you referenced customer data in particular, which raises all sorts of issues around again, the emergent behavior of these machines, your obligations around what constitutes protecting PII, the entitlement obligation that exists in our firm with Chinese walls and so forth. So this, I think, creates a really interesting and complicated landscape. This is one of the places where tooling on top of models is going to have a big influence. But one thing that you remind me of by your question and comment is one thing we're trying to orient our people around is, oftentimes we come at how do we leverage these models? And there's top-down thinking. How do we transform our firm, or bottom up? Here's a task that we can add scale to. Increasingly, I'm asking people to think from the middle out. Where do we actually have data that's distinctive, that will allow us to maintain our separation, competitive advantage, and how do we build functionality and leverage that into models? And it's a different way of thinking about the world than we traditionally have. But I think, again, in a world where the bar for what constitutes alpha or outperformance versus the mean is rising for everyone, and the ability of these machines to make all of us smarter, better, faster, we're going to have to really focus on what is that source of durable, persistent differentiation you have as an enterprise. I kind of think more and more it's going to be where do you have data that no one else does, and how can you leverage a machine to express that advantage?
Alyssa Herman, Wells Fargo. So in terms of connecting the dots between internal data, where we're at our nascence, and even understanding the data lineage, et cetera, to the public data, do you think there will be a trusted source of public data or some certification at some point that you could then join to from an internal standpoint?
Do you have a view on that?
No, do you have a view on that with your job necessarily? I think it's something
Bloomberg
for
is
me,
one very good trusted source.
Yeah, I'm like,
I think there are certainly providers out there. I think for the public data part, there are, of course, Besides Bloomberg, I have to say, sorry, I cannot just say Bloomberg here.
Yeah.
I have Moody's and Fitch and others who provide, I think, a good source of it. But more and more, they will get a little bit under pressure, right? Because with the technology they're building internally to digest all your internal data, you can also apply it to external data, right? So there is some things that they will be doing, like Bloomberg GPT and other things, and add more analytics probably on top of that. But I do think that the interesting question is more going to be along the lines that my esteemed panelist said. It's really about what data do I have that others don't have, and then can use. Look, think of it this way: the last 20 years were about algorithms, right? Google came and said, I'm going to restructure the data of the whole world, and it's all about algorithms, it's not about data. But I think now it's going back to, it's about data. Do I have this data that nobody else has, and can I capitalize on that data, right? And banks are a very good place to have lots of good data.
Yeah. I mean, one thing it makes me think of too is that the public data landscape is going to be really interesting to watch in years to come. I mean, fundamentally, the thing that enabled these systems in large part is the open data commons of the internet, and everyone's putting their data out there. In a world now where that data is being monetized by other means, do we get to more balkanization and people like, hey, wait a minute, this is my data, you can't have, you know. And so one of the interesting thought leaders in Silicon Valley, analogizes this to like a Spotify moment. Like, will we have a more balkanized data environment where rights holders are actually fairly compensated, but the platform that delivers that value to consumers has a lower margin model because they've got to federate and pay for rights? So just how this will all work out in this open data landscape is really super interesting.
I do think we have time for one more, but let's keep it short.
Yeah, lightning round.
Sure. Hi, Kevin Allison from Minerva. How are you thinking about generative AI and cybersecurity, both potentially increasing vulnerability to either phishing attacks against staff or customers, but also cyber defense? You might want a human in the loop with the way you're using generative AI, but cyber adversaries might be willing to go at machine speed on that. And so I'm curious how you're thinking and investing in those areas.
Yeah, we are definitely looking very much at that. We've got kind of a steering group that includes our CISO as well as members of her team that help us to look at that and look at it from both directions. How do we think about preventing attacks as we're going down our journey, but also how do we leverage it internally to make improvements, right, in terms of how we do our phishing, how we test for data loss prevention and the models and such we use for that, and the potential we have for deep fake technology, right? So we're doing a little education session in the first quarter with our executive committee and our board members of creating a deep fake to show them how easy it is and a couple scenarios of how it can be leveraged, using one of our most senior executives. So, I think
Please share that with the group.
No. So, but I think it's just, and other firms are doing it too. We've learned from others, but I think it's a bi-directional thing. How do we leverage it? One, fundamentally, table stakes. They have to be at the table for every conversation around incremental risk control considerations. But how do we leverage it to make us better in certain areas in the cyberspace, and how do we have full awareness of how the different threat vectors are going to become even more sophisticated and fast coming at us.
I think so, but this is why this is going to be one of the really good investment areas for young companies in Silicon Valley, where it's a classic escalation cat and mouse game between intruders and defenders, and the novelty of some of these attack vectors are going to breed a bunch of companies that are deeply specialized, have unique IP. So I think that's a very investable theme in this world.
All right, and we'll keep it there. George, Vahe, Deb, thanks for sharing your insights.
Thank you.